What's going on? Why are you arresting me? What did I do wrong? The black man asked the police as they cuffed his hands. A racist police officer thinks a black man in a park is a criminal and arrests him without cause. The officer then realized that he had just arrested an FBI agent. Watch until the end of the video to uncover the truth behind this situation. A racist police officer assumes a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him without cause. Later, the officer realizes he has just detained an FBI agent. The gentle evening sunlight bathed Silverwood Park, where Eric Johnson sat on an old wooden bench, holding a book in his hands. Around him was the cheerful sound of children playing, their laughter mixing with the soft whisper of the breeze through lush green leaves. For Eric, this park was his peaceful haven, a small corner to escape from the noise and pressures of life. But that peace was soon shattered by unwanted attention. Across the park, Officer Jason Carter was patrolling, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, searching for any sign of trouble. Jason had been patrolling this area for over 2 decades and took pride in knowing the place like the back of his hand. But when he saw Eric, a black man sitting alone, looking too calm, too confident, a sense of unease stirred within Jason. Something's not right, Jason muttered, watching Eric from a distance. He remembered a recent report about a suspect with vague features, and for Jason, that was enough to fuel his suspicion. Eric could feel the scrutinizing gaze on him. He looked up and saw Jason standing some distance away, staring at him with judgmental eyes. Eric had been in situations like this too many times and recognized that look immediately, the gaze of prejudice, disguised as concern for public safety. But Eric didn't look away or show fear. He slowly closed his book, a finger holding his place on the page, and met Jason's stare, calm and unafraid. Jason stood still for a moment, his eyes locked on Eric. He didn't like the way Eric looked back, calm, confident, as if he had nothing to hide. It annoyed Jason, making him feel challenged. "Let's see what he's up to here," Jason muttered to himself, then started walking toward Eric, each step stiff and filled with determination. Eric watched as Jason approached, keeping a calm expression. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he'd seen this situation play out countless times before. The tension was already simmering, and Eric knew that his response in the next few minutes would determine everything. He hadn't wanted to deal with this today, but he also wouldn't give Jason any excuse to escalate. "Good afternoon," Jason said as he neared the bench, his tone polite but laced with suspicion. Eric could hear the undertone. He knew exactly the type of person he was dealing with. "Good afternoon," Eric replied, calm and steady. He rested both hands on the closed book in his lap, keeping them visible so the officer wouldn't have any excuse. "What brings you here?" Jason asked, his eyes scanning Eric's face, then glancing over the book, looking for anything to justify his suspicion. "Just enjoying the park," Eric replied, still calm. "It's a nice day." Jason nodded, though he wasn't really listening. His mind was busy searching for a reason, some excuse to prove that his gut feeling was right. "You live around here?" Eric gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I come by here often." That non-committal answer made Jason uncomfortable. He shifted his stance, becoming more confrontational. "Let me see your ID," Jason demanded, his tone losing any pretense of politeness. Eric's smile faded. This was the moment where things could go in any direction. He knew his rights. He knew that sitting in a public park wasn't grounds for an ID check. But he also knew that refusing could lead to unnecessary escalation. Still, he wasn't about to let intimidation make him back down. "Am I being detained?" Eric asked, his voice steady, unflinching, as he looked directly into Jason's eyes. Jason tightened his grip on his baton at that question. It was the calmness, the refusal to submit to authority, that got under his skin. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. "If you don't cooperate, you will be detained," Jason replied, his hand moving toward his holster, his tone growing harder. Eric held Jason's gaze, his eyes steady. He took a slow breath, knowing that this could go bad at any moment, but he wasn't about to yield. "I'm just sitting in the park," Eric said, his voice measured and controlled. "Is there a law against that?" Jason was beginning to lose patience. You match the description of a suspect we're looking for, he said, though he knew how flimsy that excuse was. He stepped closer, towering over Eric as if to intimidate him. Eric didn't flinch. He looked directly at Jason, refusing to show any sign of fear or reaction. What's the description? Eric asked calmly, his tone devoid of any provocation, yet it still made Jason feel challenged. Jason's jaw clenched. He didn't have a good answer. Admitting that would mean losing control, and he couldn't let that happen. Don't play smart with me, he snapped. Hand over your ID, now. For a moment, the two men stared each other down, tension thick in the air. Eric knew he had the right to refuse, that he could assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so might make this situation even more dangerous. He decided, for now, to comply. Without a word, Eric slowly reached into his pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements that could be misinterpreted. He pulled out his wallet and handed his ID to Jason, who snatched it from him, glancing at it with clear dissatisfaction. The name on the ID meant nothing to Jason, but that didn't matter. His mind was already made up. Stand up, Jason ordered, stepping back to give Eric room to rise. Eric sighed inwardly but complied, slowly getting up from the bench, keeping his hands visible to avoid giving Jason any excuse. Turn around, Jason commanded, pulling out handcuffs. A sense of helplessness washed over Eric, but he followed instructions, turning around and allowing Jason to cuff him. Around them, people in the park began to take notice, curious eyes turning toward the scene, but Eric remained calm. The worst thing he could do now was let anger take over. Jason tightened the cuffs on Eric's wrists, a sudden feeling that something was wrong tugging at him, but his pride wouldn't let him stop now. He took Eric by the arm, leading him toward the nearby patrol car. Eric said nothing as they walked, his eyes focused forward, his mind already bracing for what was coming. He wasn't worried for himself. He knew exactly who he was and the power he held. Soon, Jason would know that too. As they approached the patrol car, Jason opened the back door and pushed Eric into the seat. Eric sat down, feeling the cold cuffs tight on his wrists. He looked out the window as the car began to move, watching the park fade from view. The green trees blurred past, and he wondered how a peaceful day like today had turned into a nightmare. The hum of the patrol car's engine filled the air as Officer Jason Carter drove Eric to the station. Jason gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. In his mind, questions swirled relentlessly. He didn't like the calmness Eric displayed. No fear, no trembling. It was as if he knew something Jason didn't. It made Jason uneasy, made him doubt his instincts. But his pride wouldn't let him admit any mistake. Eric sat silently in the back seat, his eyes unfocused on the passing scenery outside. Instead, he was thinking about what would come next. Eric knew this legal system well and was aware that one small misstep could worsen everything. But he also knew the power he held, a power that Jason had yet to realize. As they neared the police station, Jason glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Eric's eyes. What were you really doing in that park? Jason asked, his tone still heavy with suspicion. Eric looked back at him through the mirror, his face expressionless. I already told you, he replied calmly. I was just sitting and reading a book. Jason scoffed. A guy like you, just sitting and reading? You expect me to believe that? Eric raised an eyebrow. A guy like me? He repeated, his tone calm but meaningful. Jason was silent for a moment, realizing he'd let something slip that he shouldn't have. But instead of acknowledging the mistake, he doubled down. You don't seem like the type to spend an afternoon reading in the park, he said, trying to justify his actions. Eric didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, the tension in the car thickening. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and controlled. And what does someone like me look like, officer? Jason didn't answer right away, knowing there was no good response that would justify his actions. Instead, he focused on driving, his mind clouded with doubts and self-reflection. Eric's composure, the way he faced Jason without a trace of fear, left Jason feeling unsettled. The patrol car rolled into the police station parking lot, and Jason parked near the entrance. He opened the back door, helping Eric out, the handcuffs still secure around Eric's wrists. As they entered the station, the familiar noise filled the air, the rustle of paperwork, ringing phones, and bits of conversation. Jason led Eric through the main hall, ignoring the curious stares from colleagues. He wasn't ready to explain anything until he'd figured out his next move. They arrived at the processing area, and Jason signaled for Eric to stand by the intake desk. The officer on duty was Alex, a young cop who looked up as Jason brought someone in. "What's going on, Carter?" Alex asked, his gaze shifting briefly to Eric before turning back to Jason. "Caught him acting suspiciously in the park," Jason replied, his voice tense. He handed over Eric's ID, still reluctant to admit he had no solid reason for the arrest. Alex glanced at the ID, then looked back at Eric. A flicker of recognition crossed Alex's eyes before he quickly masked it, nodding and beginning to type the information into the computer. Eric noticed that slight hesitation and made a mental note of it. Someone in this station knew who he was. "Captain Monroe is in her office," Alex said, handing the ID back to Jason. "You should take him to see her." Jason hesitated. Captain Rachel Monroe was known for being strict but fair, always following procedures to the letter. He hadn't planned on involving her this soon, but now he didn't have a choice. "All right," Jason said, unable to hide his unease. He turned to Eric, taking him by the arm and leading him toward Captain Monroe's office. Each step felt heavier as he walked, unable to shake the feeling that things were slipping out of his control. Eric walked alongside him, still calm and composed. He could sense Jason's unease, the uncertainty he was trying to hide. It was a good sign. A small crack in the officer's tough exterior, and Eric quietly took note of it. Jason knocked on Captain Monroe's office door, and after hearing her voice from within, he opened it. Her office was orderly and commanding, with a large desk at the center and tall bookshelves lining the walls. Captain Monroe, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up as Jason and Eric stepped in. "Officer Carter, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of skepticism. Jason straightened up, bringing Eric into the room. "I apprehended this man in the park, Captain. He was acting suspiciously and refused to cooperate when I asked for his ID." Captain Monroe glanced over at Eric, and for a brief moment, there was a flash of recognition in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, maintaining a professional expression. "Is that so?" she replied, her tone neutral. Eric met her gaze, realizing that Captain Monroe knew who he was, though she was playing it cautiously, waiting to see how Jason would handle this. Unaware of this silent exchange, Jason continued, his tone slightly strained. "I brought him in for questioning, Captain." Captain Monroe nodded, her eyes still fixed on Eric. "I see. Do you have any evidence to justify holding him?" Jason hesitated, feeling the ground start to give way beneath him. "He wouldn't cooperate, Captain," he repeated, but the confidence in his voice was faltering. Captain Monroe leaned back in her chair, her gaze still, sharp as she looked at Jason. "Officer Carter, could you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Johnson privately." Jason blinked, surprised by the request. "But, Captain—" "Step outside, Carter." Monroe's voice sharpened, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Jason released Eric and left the room, closing the door behind him. As soon as it was shut, Captain Monroe's posture softened, and her tone eased. "Mr. Johnson," she said calmly, "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Eric offered a slight smile, showing no sign of anger. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job," Monroe sighed, glancing briefly at the closed door before looking back at Eric. "I know who you are, but I wanted to handle this situation carefully. I'll be speaking with Officer Carter." Eric nodded, his expression growing serious. "I understand. I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." "They will be," Monroe assured him, her tone firm. "I'll have a word with Officer Carter and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you were from the start?" Eric's smile faded, replaced by a look of solemnity. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. Who I am shouldn't be the reason he treats me with respect." Captain Monroe paused, reflecting on Eric's words, and then nodded, a trace of understanding in her eyes. You're right. It shouldn't matter who you are, but unfortunately, for some people, it does. The room fell into a heavy silence. Finally, Monroe stood up. I'll call Officer Carter back in. We'll get this settled. Eric nodded in agreement, his expression steady as she walked over to the door. The door opened, and Jason stepped back into the room, his face tense. He could sense that something had shifted, but he wasn't sure what. He looked at Eric, who stood there calmly, as if nothing had happened. Mr. Johnson is not the person we're looking for. You'll release him immediately, Monroe declared, her voice resolute. Jason blinked, taking a moment to process her words. But, Captain, immediately, Monroe repeated, leaving no room for objection. Jason hesitated, then reached for the keys to unlock the handcuffs. His hands shook slightly as he freed Eric, the weight of his mistake slowly sinking in. Eric rubbed his wrists, looking Jason in the eye. Thank you, officer, he said, his voice soft but firm. Jason swallowed, struggling to find something to say but coming up short. You're free to go, he mumbled. Eric nodded, then turned to Captain Monroe. I'll be in touch, Captain, he said, his voice calm but with an underlying tone of gravity. There's still much to discuss. Monroe nodded in return, her expression one of understanding. I look forward to it, Mr. Johnson. With that, Eric left the office, leaving Jason standing there with a hollow feeling. The confrontation was over, but Jason knew the consequences were just beginning. Back at his desk, Jason Carter tried to focus, but his mind was anything but settled. The encounter with Eric Johnson wouldn't leave his thoughts. It lingered like a shadow. He knew he'd made a mistake, and the more he thought about it, the more he grasped the depth of his error. The station felt different. Familiar sounds of keyboards, ringing phones, and conversations now seemed distant and foreboding. What had once brought comfort now only reminded him of what he might lose. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Captain Monroe approaching, her expression serious and void of any relief. Officer Carter, in my office. Now, Monroe ordered, leaving no room for debate. Jason immediately rose, trying to conceal the anxiety knotting within him. He followed her into the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Monroe shut the door and pointed to the chair across from her desk. Jason sat down, trying to steady himself as an unspoken tension filled the room. Monroe took her seat, her sharp gaze fixed on Jason. Officer Carter, do you have any idea who Eric Johnson is? Jason frowned, clearly unaware. No, Captain. Just some man in the park. Monroe leaned forward, her eyes never leaving him. Eric Johnson isn't just some man in the park. He's an FBI agent, and not just any agent, but one of their top operatives. Her words hit Jason like a blow, leaving him stunned. An FBI agent? He whispered, eyes wide in shock. Yes, Monroe confirmed, her tone stern. And he's not just any agent. He's one of the most respected individuals within the Bureau. Detaining him like this could have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire department. Jason listened, feeling as though everything around him was crumbling. He had made a decision based on his own biases, and now he was facing the consequences of that choice. I didn't know, Captain, Jason said, his voice shaky and weak. I didn't know who he was. Monroe looked at Jason sternly. That's the problem, Carter. It shouldn't matter who he was. The issue is that you acted on assumptions and baseless prejudice. You made a decision without clear evidence, and that's unacceptable. Jason wanted to defend himself, to find words to justify his actions, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew Monroe was right. He had let his personal biases cloud his judgment, and now, the consequences were waiting. Monroe leaned back in her chair, her tone softening slightly. For now, you're suspended pending an investigation. The final decision will depend on the results of that investigation, and it may include your termination. Jason felt his heart sink. The word termination hung in the air like an unavoidable sentence. For more than 20 years, he had served as an officer. The thought of losing his badge was terrifying. I understand, Captain, he finally replied, his voice faint. Monroe looked at him for a long moment before speaking, her tone gentler. We all make mistakes, Carter. But it's how we handle those mistakes that defines us. You have a chance to reflect, to learn, and to become better. Jason looked up at Captain Monroe, seeing in her eyes not anger, but disappointment and perhaps a glimmer of hope. It was a hard moment, but also an opportunity to face the truth and change. As Jason stepped out of Monroe's office, the weight on his shoulders felt almost unbearable. His steps carried him instinctively back toward his desk, though his mind was in turmoil. The career he'd built over more than 2 decades was on the edge, and he could only blame himself. Jason sat down, staring blankly at his cluttered desk. Old coffee cups, paperwork, and photos from past cases, all reminders of the past, of what he had once taken pride in. But now, they felt like fragments of an image he wasn't sure he could hold on to. Suddenly, a light knock on the door broke the silence. Jason looked up to see Alex standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with sympathy. "Officer Carter," Alex said quietly, stepping into the room. "The captain wanted me to let you know that Mr. Johnson would like to see you." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Part of him wanted to refuse, to avoid this encounter, but he knew that running away would only make things worse. He nodded slowly, standing up to follow Alex into the small adjacent meeting room. The door opened, and Jason saw Eric Johnson sitting there, calm and serious. Jason could feel the power emanating from Eric, not the power of someone towering over others, but the kind that comes from a steady confidence in one's own worth. Alex gave Jason a slight nod before leaving the room, leaving the two men face to face. Jason stepped in, closed the door, and took a seat across from Eric. Eric studied Jason for a moment, saying nothing, simply observing. Jason felt the weight of that gaze, as if it saw right through the walls he tried to build around himself. Finally, Eric spoke, his voice calm yet profound. "I don't hold any personal grudge against you, Officer Carter," Eric said, "but I hope you can see this as an opportunity to change, to recognize and confront your own biases." Jason swallowed hard, a wave of regret and shame washing over him. I didn't mean for things to turn out like this," he said, his voice shaking. I thought I was doing the right thing." Eric nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand. But it's not just about what you think. It's about how those thoughts shape your actions. The prejudices you carry don't only hurt others, they harm you as well, and the community you're meant to protect." Jason bowed his head, feeling the weight of Eric's words. It was true. What he'd done hadn't only wronged Eric, it had betrayed the very values he once took pride in upholding. He took a deep breath, searching for words, but he could only manage to, "I'm sorry." Eric looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Apologizing is a good start, but what matters is what you do next. I'm not here to destroy your career, Carter. I'm here because I want to see real change, not just from you, but from the entire system you represent." Jason looked up at Eric, sensing the sincerity and determination in his words. This wasn't just about forgiveness, it was a call for transformation. "What will you do to change, Carter?" Eric asked, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly at Jason. Jason took a deep breath, his eyes filled with newfound resolve. "I'll learn from my mistakes. I'll do everything in my power to be a better cop, a better person. And I promise that this will never happen to anyone else." Eric held Jason's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. "I hope you keep your word. This community needs people like you, but only when you're ready to face the truth and change." Jason nodded, a sense of relief slowly creeping in. This wasn't a full pardon, but it was a chance, and he wouldn't waste it. The conversation ended, and as Eric stood up, Jason did the same. They shook hands, the grip firm, but without the need for further words. It was an understanding between two men, each knowing that the journey ahead would be tough but necessary. Eric stepped out of the meeting room, and Jason stood for a moment, watching the door close behind him. Part of him felt anxious about the future, but another part, one that was beginning to awaken, knew this was necessary. He needed to change, and it wasn't just about words. He needed action. Jason left the room and walked straight to Captain Monroe's office. He knocked, and Monroe's voice came from inside, granting him permission to enter. Monroe looked up when Jason walked in. "Carter, what do you need to say?" she asked, her face serious. Jason stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "Captain, I want to participate in any training on bias and de-escalation that the department is offering. I want to correct my mistakes and learn how to be a better officer." Monroe looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Are you sure about this, Carter? These trainings won't be easy, especially when you're facing your own mistakes." Jason nodded without hesitation. "I'm sure, Captain. I need to do this, not just for me, but for the community I've harmed." Monroe silently studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, Carter. I'll arrange for you to join the training. And I hope you understand that this is just the beginning." Jason nodded. "I understand, Captain. I'll do everything I can to make things right." Monroe gave him a rare, gentle smile, her usually stern face softening. "I hope so, Carter. You have potential, but you need to learn how to use it the right way." Jason left Monroe's office with a new sense of purpose. He knew he had made a huge mistake, but he also knew he had a chance to make it right. He wouldn't waste this opportunity, not just for his career, but for the community he had sworn to protect. The next day, the sky was still overcast with gray clouds as Eric entered the police station. He had been invited by Captain Monroe to discuss the next steps in improving the station's processes and work culture. What Eric had experienced wasn't just a lesson for Officer Carter, it was a lesson for the entire system. He was determined to turn this situation into an opportunity for change. Inside the police station, the atmosphere felt a little different from the last time Eric had been there. He noticed new posters hung up, promoting upcoming training sessions on addressing bias and de-escalation techniques. The officers he passed on his way through greeted him with respect, some eyes full of remorse, others thoughtful. Eric walked into Captain Monroe's office and found her waiting for him. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Johnson," she said, standing to shake his hand. "I wanted to discuss the changes we're implementing." Eric nodded and sat down. "I'm glad to see these first steps, Captain, but I understand this is only the beginning. Change needs to be sustained and developed." Monroe nodded seriously. "You're absolutely right. We've planned mandatory training on bias and de-escalation skills, and I also want to set up an independent oversight group to ensure transparency in our processes." Eric felt a spark of hope. These were the changes he wanted to see. Real changes, not just temporary actions to placate the public. "I'd be happy to help, Captain. This is an opportunity for us to build a fairer and safer system for everyone." Monroe looked him in the eye and nodded. "I appreciate your willingness. We need your involvement, not just as an FBI agent, but as someone with experience facing injustice." Eric smiled. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Captain. I just want to make sure this police station can be a place the community can trust." Monroe returned a small smile. "Let's work together to make that happen, Mr. Johnson." The conversation between Eric and Captain Monroe ended with a sense of resolve and hope. As Eric left her office, he felt that he wasn't just doing the job of an FBI agent, but also representing the change the community needed. He stepped out of the police station, the cool morning air clearing his mind. The changes had begun, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be opposition, people who didn't want to change and preferred the old ways. But Eric was used to facing challenges, and he would never stop fighting for what he believed was right. In the days that followed, the Silverwood Police Department began to change. Mandatory training sessions on bias and de-escalation techniques were implemented for all officers. Captain Monroe established an independent oversight group to monitor police activities, ensuring that every decision was made with fairness and transparency. Jason Carter, who had once stood on the verge of losing his job, now actively participated in the training. He was no longer the rigid, self-assured officer he once was. What had happened with Eric had opened his eyes. Jason knew that his career wouldn't survive unless he changed, but more than that, he realized that being a police officer wasn't just about making arrests and conducting investigations. It was about protecting and serving the community with compassion and respect. One afternoon, Jason sought out Eric. They met at Silverwood Park, the place where it all began. Jason invited Eric to sit on a bench, and as the soft breeze carried the sounds of children's laughter around them, Jason looked at Eric with sincere eyes. "I want to thank you," Jason said, his voice deep and heartfelt. Not just for not making things worse for me, but for giving me the chance to change. Eric looked into Jason's eyes and smiled faintly. Carter, I didn't give you a chance. You created the opportunity for yourself. What matters is that you seized it, and that's something I respect. Jason nodded, his gaze firm with determination. I promise I will never let my biases control my decisions again. I've learned that our job isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about building trust with the community. Eric smiled. You've got it, Carter. It's not easy, but if you stay on this path, you'll do a lot of good for the community. They sat in silence for a moment, taking in the surroundings. Silverwood Park remained a peaceful place, a small corner of the city where both Eric and Jason had found their own meaning. After a while, Eric stood up. I've got to go, but I'm sure we'll cross paths again. Jason also stood, shaking Eric's hand, a firm and respectful grip. I'm looking forward to that, Johnson. Thank you, not just for what you did, but for teaching me a valuable lesson. Eric smiled, his eyes lighting up with understanding. We all learn from each other, Carter. Good luck. With those words, Eric turned and left the park, leaving Jason standing there, his eyes following. As Eric walked away, Jason sat back down on the bench, feeling something new. No longer regret, but hope. Hope that from now on, he could become the officer the community truly needed. After that meeting at Silverwood Park, Jason Carter continued his work at the police station with a completely different attitude. In the days that followed, he made an effort to work with a more open mind, paying closer attention to what was happening around him. The training on bias, situational handling, and the conversations with Eric taught him a lot, not only about professional skills but also about how to treat others with dignity. The Silverwood community also felt the change. Jason was no longer the officer who eyed any stranger with suspicion when they entered his area. Instead, he took the time to get to know the people living around the park, learning their names, knowing about their families, and truly listening to their concerns, fears, and hopes. This transformation not only improved the relationship between the police and the community, but also helped Jason gain a deeper understanding of the meaning behind the work he was doing. One morning, as Jason sat in the station writing up a report on a recent case, there was a knock on the door. He looked up and saw Captain Monroe standing in the doorway, her face serious but with a hint of satisfaction. Carter, Mr. Johnson wants to see you, Monroe said. He's waiting in the conference room. Jason nodded, setting down his pen and standing up. He followed Captain Monroe down the hall to the conference room. When he entered, he saw Eric sitting there, smiling but with a watchful eye. Hey, Carter, Eric said, his voice low and friendly. I just wanted to stop by and see how you're doing. I've heard you've been actively participating in the training, and the community's been saying that you're doing a lot better. Jason gave a small, somewhat shy smile. I'm just trying to do the right thing, Johnson. I know I've made mistakes, and I don't want them to happen again. Eric nodded, his gaze filled with approval. You've done it, Carter. The community needs officers like you, those willing to change and learn from their mistakes. Jason lowered his head, feeling Eric's encouragement as a huge motivator. Thank you, Johnson. I know there's still a lot to be done, but I'm committed to improving myself every day. Eric smiled and extended his hand to shake Jason's. We're all on the learning path, Carter. The important thing is that you keep striving. Jason shook Eric's hand, feeling the firm and supportive grip. As they let go, Eric stood and looked Jason in the eyes. You know, I believe you're going to go even further, not just as a good officer, but as someone who truly cares about their community. Jason watched Eric as he left, his heart full of gratitude and determination. I won't let you down. Eric nodded one last time and left the room, leaving Jason sitting there with a warm feeling in his heart. He knew that from now on, his responsibility was not only to do his job well, but also to become someone trustworthy, someone the community could rely on. With that determination, Jason returned to his desk, picked up his pen, and continued working on the report he had left unfinished. He knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but he was ready to face it, ready to change, and ready to become a police officer that everyone could be proud of. A few weeks later, the Silverwood Police Department became a focal point for positive changes. Training sessions on bias and de-escalation skills became an essential part of the officers' training process. Some officers were initially hesitant, but as they saw the noticeable change in Jason's work and his open attitude, they slowly realized that this wasn't just a requirement. It was an opportunity to improve themselves and serve the community better. Jason had become a prime example of transformation. He was no longer the cold, stern officer he once was. Now, Jason spent more time interacting with the community. He showed up at neighborhood meetings, participated in charity events, and, most importantly, made friends with those he had once been skeptical of. His presence at these events not only helped him better understand the people he was protecting but also eased the tension between the police and the public. One afternoon, Jason was standing next to a patrol car in Silverwood Park, talking to a few residents about recent security concerns. He noticed Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman who often took walks in the park, approaching him with a smile on her face. "Officer Carter," Mrs. Wilson called out, her voice frail but warm. "I just wanted to thank you for coming to the neighborhood meeting last week and helping us with the security issues. You did a great job." Jason smiled and bent down slightly to listen to her. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. It's my job. I'm just happy I could help." Mrs. Wilson nodded and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, a gesture of fondness and respect. "You're not just doing your job, son. You're doing more than that. You're making us feel safer and heard. That's priceless." Jason felt the warmth in her words, and his heart was filled with strength. "I really appreciate you saying that. I promise I'll keep trying to do better." After Mrs. Wilson walked away, Jason stood still for a moment, looking around the park. He saw children playing, families strolling, and people like Mrs. Wilson, people who just needed a little sense of safety to enjoy their daily lives. It was in this moment that Jason realized the true meaning of his work. It wasn't just about enforcing the law or making arrests. It was about building trust, protecting the vulnerable, and bringing hope to the community. As the sunset slowly descended, Jason returned to his patrol car, grabbed the radio, and reported the situation. Before leaving the park, he glanced back one last time, his eyes filled with determination. This journey, from mistakes to change, had made him a better person, and Jason knew this was just the beginning. He would continue to fight, not only against crime, but against himself, the biases and limitations he had once placed on his own path. And with each step, he knew he was doing the right thing, not just because of the badge on his chest, but because the community had placed their trust in him. In the months that followed, the changes at the Silverwood Police Department and within Jason Carter himself were no longer just promises on paper, they had become reality. Jason had overcome his challenges and became an integral part of the effort to improve the relationship between the police and the community. He became one of the lead trainers for new officers, sharing his personal story of mistakes and redemption to help his colleagues understand the importance of fairness and respect. One day, the Silverwood Police Department hosted a special community meeting. This gathering included not only police officers and residents, but also representatives from local organizations and the press. It was an opportunity for the department to share the changes they had made and for the community to see their commitment to building trust. Jason stood at the front of the room, preparing to speak. His eyes scanned the crowd, seeing many familiar faces: Mrs. Wilson, families from the neighborhood, and even colleagues who had once been skeptical but now stood beside him, offering their support. Nearby, Eric Johnson leaned against the wall, his eyes shining with pride and encouragement. Jason took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice clear and sincere. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Officer Jason Carter. I want to start by thanking you all for being here today and for your patience with us over the past months. We know it hasn't been easy to rebuild trust, and sometimes we've made mistakes. I'm standing here today to admit that I was once one of the ones who made those mistakes." The room fell silent, all eyes on Jason. "I arrested an innocent person simply because I let my own biases lead my actions. That is something I deeply regret. But the most important thing I learned from that mistake is this: we can change. None of us are perfect, but we can learn, we can grow, and we can become better." Jason glanced over at Eric, who had always been a great source of encouragement for him during this journey. "I had the chance to meet Mr. Eric Johnson, a man who not only forgave me but also helped me understand my true responsibility to the community. He showed me that being a police officer is not just about enforcing the law, but about being a protector, a builder of trust. Eric gave a small nod, his eyes sparkling with pride. Jason turned back to the crowd and continued speaking. I want everyone to know that from this day forward, the Silverwood Police Department is not only committed to our work, but also to listening, understanding, and learning from the very people we serve. We will never let the mistakes of the past repeat, and we will do everything we can to build a safe, just, and compassionate community. The applause started slow but quickly spread across the room. Jason felt a sense of relief, as if he had laid the first brick in a new foundation, a foundation built on trust and the determination to change. As the meeting came to a close, Eric approached Jason, patting him gently on the back. You did great, Carter, Eric said, his voice sincere. I believe this will be a turning point for you and for this police department. Jason smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Johnson. Thank you for giving me the chance to change. Eric looked at Jason, smiling warmly. We all deserve the chance to change, Carter. What matters is that you've seized it. They shook hands, and the handshake was no longer just between an officer and an FBI agent, but a connection between two people who had faced adversity together and were now working side by side to build a better future. As the evening drew to a close, Jason paused and looked at the Silverwood Police Department. It was no longer just a workplace, but a symbol of renewal and hope. He knew the journey was far from over, but he was ready to continue, not just as a police officer, but as someone the community could trust and rely on. Months later, the positive changes at the Silverwood Police Department had spread far beyond the city, attracting attention from neighboring areas. The story of Officer Jason Carter, who had made mistakes but confronted them and was willing to change, became a model of growth and reform within the police force. One morning, while patrolling around Silverwood Park, Jason saw a group of children playing soccer. Their laughter filled the air, and Jason couldn't help but smile. He remembered the first time he met Eric Johnson in that same park, when prejudice and doubt clouded his judgment. Now, everything had changed. He watched the carefree children playing and deeply felt the transformation he was helping to create. Suddenly, one of the kids kicked the ball too hard, sending it soaring high into the air before it rolled toward Jason. A boy quickly ran over, but when he saw Jason in his police uniform, he hesitated, uncertainty on his face. Jason smiled, bent down to pick up the ball, and handed it to the boy. Here you go, he said gently. Be careful next time. The boy looked up at him, then smiled back, his eyes lighting up with admiration. Thanks, officer, the boy said, his voice full of excitement. Jason ruffled the boy's hair and stood up straight, watching the group of kids continue to play. In that moment, Jason realized that he had achieved something he had never thought possible before, becoming someone the younger generation could trust and look up to with respect. That afternoon, Jason returned to the Silverwood Police Department. He passed through the main lobby, where a press conference was taking place to announce the changes in procedures and approaches at the department. Captain Monroe was on stage, talking about the team's efforts to create a more fair and transparent system. Jason stood in the back, not wanting to draw attention to himself, but listening intently. Monroe mentioned him, sharing his story as a prime example of how an individual could change. She emphasized that real change didn't just come from the system but from each person within that system. When the press conference ended, Jason walked up to Captain Monroe, who was speaking with several reporters. When Monroe saw him, she smiled and motioned for him to come closer. Jason, I just mentioned you, Monroe said, her voice full of pride. You're a big part of this change. Jason nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Captain. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. Monroe smiled and gave his shoulder a light pat. Sometimes, doing the right thing is the hardest part, but you've shown that it's possible. Just then, Eric Johnson stepped forward, nodded at Captain Monroe, and turned to Jason. I just heard Mrs. Monroe's speech. You're making me proud, Carter. Jason smiled, his eyes shining. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'm proud to be standing here today, and I know I'm on the right path. Eric nodded and leaned toward Jason, his voice dropping but full of sincerity. You know, change doesn't just come from big decisions. It comes from small actions every day. And today, I see you doing just that. Jason looked into Eric's eyes, and a warm feeling spread through him. This wasn't just the story of one person who had made mistakes and corrected them. It was the story of an entire community, learning, forgiving, and working together to create a better environment. That evening, when Jason returned home, he sat down in his chair and looked out the window at the city slipping into darkness. The streetlights twinkled, and Jason knew that he had played a small part in making this place safer and more just. He no longer felt empty or afraid of the future. Instead, he felt he had a purpose he would continue to pursue with all his passion and determination. Jason Carter, once an officer with biases and mistakes, had now become a true protector, a symbol of change and hope for the community he cherished.